Hello and good afternoon. Welcome today to today's NDARC webinar. I'm very pleased to be your host today. My name is Dr. Sarah Farnbach. I'm a research fellow and program lead here at NDARC. So before we start, I just want to take a moment to show my respect and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Today I'm dialing in from Gadigal land, and it's a beautiful sunny day here, as I hope it is where you are as well. So welcome to everyone. Before we get started, I'm just going to talk us through some housekeeping. Today, we have the good fortune of being joined by presenter Dr. Emily Deans. Emily is going to talk us through a project that she's worked on and also be joined by a co-presenter, Mr. Joe Abdo, during the presentation and also during the panel. So Emily is a research strategy and design coordinator at Youth Solutions and works part-time here for us at NDARC as well. We're quite lucky to have her across both roles. She's an experienced qualitative researcher, and her focus is on understanding environmental and structural influences of risk decisions and health behaviours. Emily has worked in the not-for-profit sector for over 5 years and works to build the capacity of smaller organisations to conduct research. As I mentioned, Joe is also going to join us. Joe is a mental health clinician at Niemeyer and comes from a social work background. He's passionate about providing mental health support for various populations and enjoys working across a range of practice areas and policy and research. He has extensive experience working across the sector, including in child protection, family therapy, alcohol and other drugs, as well as gambling and eating disorders. So after the presentation, we're going to have a chance to have some questions. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, into the Q&A function, and I'll try to get to them. Today, the presentation that Joe and Emily are going to present is called A Qualitative Study Exploring Offenders' Perspectives of Alcohol and Other Drugs. So before we get started, I just wanted to flag as well. So today's discussion might have some themes that might be traumatic for some people. So if you are concerned or have worries about any of the topics raised, please feel free to contact Lifeline or the Blue Knot Foundation. So I think that's it from me. I've covered off all the housekeeping. So I'd just like to welcome Joe and Emily and ask them to please turn on their cameras. Hi, there's Emily.
Thanks, Sarah.
And thanks, Emily. I can see your slide there. That's great. And Joe, when you're ready, feel free to turn on your camera as well. Hi, welcome.
Hello.
Okay, so I'll hand over to you to present. Yeah, thanks. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Awesome. So hi, everyone. I'm Emily and I've roped Joe into presenting with me as well. And we're going to present on a piece of work that we did last year with a group of young people who were in contact with the youth justice system. So before we get into it, I do want to start with a funding declaration. So the South West Sydney LHD Drug Health Services have been very supportive of the research program at Youth Solutions. So just want to flag that this project and this research would not have been able to be done without their funding support, and also acknowledge our co-investigators, so Dr. Elizabeth Conroy and Professor Georgie from University of Sydney. I am also dialing in from Gadigal land and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today, and extend that respect more broadly. So I always like to put a bit of a mural, put it back to our workshop activities. So this particular artwork was done by Camden High School students who participated in Archucation, which is a youth drug and alcohol harm reduction, health promotion workshop series that Youth Solutions run, obviously guided by Aboriginal artist Danielle Mate. Alrighty, so I do want to start by setting the scene and give a bit of a background about Youth Solutions, the type of work that we do, the type of research that we're trying to get off the ground. So Youth Solutions is a not-for-profit alcohol and other drug harm reduction, harm prevention, youth service. We operate in the Macarthur and Wingecarribee regions of New South Wales, and we are closely connected to community. we're trying to use research as a platform to advocate for the needs of our service users. So I'm a qual girl, and any research that comes out of our organisation is really designed to be participatory. It's very much informed by qualitative inquiry, and we really want to provide a space for young people to express their experiences, their thoughts around alcohol and other drugs in a safe and confidential way. So I just want to draw attention to this slogan because I think it encapsulates what we're trying to do. And this powerful slogan arose from the struggle of people with disabilities in South Africa. And it's used to communicate the idea that policy, services, strategies shouldn't be decided by any representative without the full and direct participation of members on the receiving end of those policies or those programs. So nothing about us without us is for us. So I think I always use that as my mantra. What are we wanting to achieve through the research program at Youth Solutions? We really want to provide a space for our young people to have a say around drugs and alcohol. And one of the groups that we do work with is young people who are in contact with the youth justice system. And compared to adult offending, AOD use is heavily implicated, I guess, in youth offending. And the most recent Young People in Custody Health Survey, which has, I believe, a sexennial project cycle, so there will be new data soon coming out. But that particular survey found that lifetime illicit drug use remains quite common among young people who are in contact with the justice system. We also know that a significant proportion of young people within that sample have developed problematic patterns of consumption, and you can see those stats on the screen there, meeting sort of severity of dependent scales and criteria for dependency around those different substances. And we also know that up to 3/4 of young offenders detained by police were intoxicated at the time of their offence, and 2/3 reported committing crime to actually obtain substances. And the final point, which I think is really important to think about, is that problematic substance use has been shown to be a strong predictor of previous incarceration, but as well as that reincarceration and that cycle of contact with custody in Australia. All right, so before jumping into, a little bit about methods and what we did, I just want to flag that the research is guided by a constructivist grounded theory, epistemology, which really acknowledges the co-creation of knowledge and all of our subjective truths, I guess. The research team and the participants in this study have a particular lens, obviously, in which they see the world, which is going to then impact upon the way data is collected, the way data is coded, the way data is interpreted. So just want to flag that a CGT approach actually acknowledges that first and foremost. All right, so what did we do? We basically recruited from youth justice centres in New South Wales. And in total, we were able to have a chat with 30 young people between the ages of 13 and 18. And we were it says semi-structured, but I think, Jo, we were probably unstructured and flexible, weren't we? We were ready to just go with whatever happened. Yeah.
Yes, we let the conversation flow because, there's a lot of rich content coming from these groups and a lot of passion.
Yeah. So we had fun. They were challenging focus groups, but fun focus groups. So to give you a bit of a snapshot of the population, a proportion did identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. We had about 11 young people in that heritage cohort, as well as 3 Pacific young people. We also had a bit of representation from young people with a refugee background as well. You can see that 60% were female and 40% were male, which is really quite unique for these types of studies. Often they're quite dominated by male samples. So that was something that we were really happy about, that we got to have a bit of a mix. And all had used a variety of illicit substances. I learnt a lot. I don't know whether you learnt anything, Jo, but I learnt a lot of...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I learnt a lot about all the different street names of all the different substances. So very, very clever about where you might source drugs, what substances do, and very familiar with all the different types of drugs on the market, I guess. 20% of the the sample that we sort of spoke to had self-disclosed that they had also sought treatment for their drug use. However, this was typically mandated as part of their sentencing agreement. So wasn't always a choice to go, hey, yeah, I'm going to go and seek treatment for this. Is there anything else you wanted to add in there, Joe, or have I provided a good snapshot?
I think you did a great snapshot, but this the ending where a lot of the young people we interviewed, a lot of them came, incidental treatment. It wasn't really deliberate, nor was it more of a choice. It was more like they just found themselves something to do, or tick a box, or it was very much at sort of the. I guess when we look at spectrum, it was kind of at the end of that spectrum of support. So yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. And I will also mention that we did focus groups at youth justice settings, and we did have a few instances where young people would actually come back. So it says 30 young people all up, but sometimes, we had young people who had attended 2 or 3 focus groups, and they were a great way of trying to build rapport with young people and also get them to get their mates to come along. So that also happened throughout our recruitment. All right, I think I'm going to hand it over to Joe to just chat through the theme 1 that came out of our study. So what did we find? Over to you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thanks so much. And thank you for introducing me. So theme 1, low levels of harm reduction, knowledge, and limited access to alcohol and other drug education. So it was quite intricate in how how young people's experience was happening, because a lot of the times when you're looking from outside these facilities and young people and you try to understand it, it looks very different to when you start to actually get to the bottom of the conversation, what's happening. So one finding we found is that the harm reduction knowledge and literacy in young people was quite limited. And that wasn't that they chose not to learn, or they didn't want to, it's not that they didn't want to educate. It's just that they had no resources, or very limited resources to actually be able to engage with that. And so what happens with sort of a low resource-driven environment around education, but you also at the same time, you had young people coming from environments where, drug usage was quite normalized and exacerbated by various supply networks. On one hand, you had, high supply, but very limited drug and alcohol literacy. And so what you get is that you get, pockets of culture or populations where they have very different, knowledge bases of what sort of substances are, what was accepted. And I know in the groups, when we're doing the focus groups, we have a lot of different debates and opinions around, no, alcohol is acceptable, no, it's not acceptable, but, using meth is more biased, it would be more accepted. So it was quite interesting in these constructs that these young people were telling us, and very much so it was a deliberate construct from their own experiences. And so, what we found is that why drug and alcohol education was quite limited. Their use, the background of knowledge about their use and how they use was very much reinforced by their environment. And so young people were actually able to articulate how they'll smoke marijuana or how they'll use meth, and they were actually able to say that. And so, it really does highlight a gap in the knowledge of where services are going and what's happening. But I think also that's something we can address later. But what really stood out was harm reduction, because a lot of the young people were coming into these interviews and saying, how do I do this? How do I do harm reduction? What is it? And they were so interested in learning. And so, even when they've gone through rehab facilities, they still come out and they're quite limited in literacy and even being able to describe what they need to do to practice harm minimization. And so, when you have those factors going through, at the same time, you have the limited access to alcohol and drugs education, then, their coping strategy, in dealing with stress and other factors, well, you're going to think, well, yeah, no wonder why they're just using the resources they have in their environment. And very much that's kind of one of the second theme that we found. But if we go to the next slide, we can actually look at this, one of the quotes.
Yep, I'm just going to jump in too, Joe. I think we had 2 examples of where the young people that we were talking to could actually give us an example of what a harm reduction strategy is, or how they might mitigate harm. And, just simple stuff like, having a sober mate when, drug use is happening in a particular context. We had a 14-year-old boy who used cannabis with his mates, but was very deliberate about not using in the setting where everyone else was. And we had another example as well around, using substances like GHB on top of alcohol. They were the two examples out of all of the focus groups that we got some solid understanding around how you reduce harm. So that kind of gives you a picture. Out of all of our discussions, they were the two examples that we were given, I guess.
And so basically in this quote, it was a young 14-year-old Aboriginal identifying young person. And they were really talking about, there was more of a reflection about their experience. And, the quotes, I didn't really know what it was. And that really highlights the lack of education available for these young people. And then, if they had the chance to change their experience with obviously identifying where the gaps are in education, then perhaps this young person's, experience would have been quite different. And so, it really does talk about these structural issues and, drug and alcohol education, the gap there. So that was a really powerful quote that came out among quite many. Emily, did you want to say anything to the quote? Or?
Yeah. I'll just point to, I guess, a lot of the initiation to drug use among the sample was very early. So I think the earliest was around 7 years, and it was well before that 12-year-old sort of age group. So you can kind of comprehend, that's another factor here to consider, that these substances were often introduced to young people well before their adolescent years, I guess, and in environments where, it was quite normalized. So, yeah.
And Emily, I wanted to add to that as well. So yes, absolutely. So when education started to occur, young people already finding themselves in the context of substance usage or around that. And so, there's sort of, I don't know what we kind of saw, but we saw sort of this shift of education being delivered later, when actually it would have been helpful to be delivered way before they get to that point. Yeah. And so here's another example. Here's another example where example around harm reduction, where a young person was using GHB, and again she was 18 years old, female, identifying Aboriginal. I didn't realize it's a drug like men give to girls, and so in terms of reflecting and harm reduction or harm minimization strategies, it wasn't till after that they can reflect and then start incorporating harm reduction in their own form of what they understood it was. And so, they were quite risk averse, but only when they've gone through a very difficult experience, as opposed to being preventative. And so it talks about, their insight and their willingness to sort of shift. Emily, did you want to say anything?
No, I think you said it really well, Joe. Yeah, I think only through experience of harm did they realized that it was actually, there can be a few risks here. There can be consequences. How do we keep safe in this situation? They've only learned that through trial and error, and they've only got to that space because they've been put in a really hard spot. So we want to make sure that young people are able to be empowered and equipped with the harm reduction knowledge that they need prior to actually going through the harm that could result. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so thing two, it basically carries on from the first point what I was talking about. So the environment is a massive driver of the influence to use and what sort of drugs and substances young people have access to. And so a lot of the substance use was introduced to these young people quite early on in their life, or they've seen role models or family networks use, or their friends were using. And so, going back to what I was talking about before around the distinction between what drugs were acceptable over others and what hierarchy of drugs was, acceptable, it all depended on that person's experience and exposure. A lot of the substance use a lot of the times it surrounded a lot of loss and trauma. So, even sitting in the room as a clinician, and as a researcher, you can actually feel the heaviness and the trauma of these young people that they've gone through as they're speaking about their experiences. And really, it's quite profound in the connection between the substance use and the trauma. And some, a lot of the times it's identified some people, young people use as a distraction to forget about other pains and negatives that they had that was reinforced by their environment, like a lack of support, lack of resources, a lack of opportunities, and so forth. And then there's a lot of psychological distress. And so when you have a situation in any environment that warrants significant stress, trauma, lack of resources, a lack of access to, services, and you have significant distress, and then you have coping strategies that people around you are coping with, or then you're going to start to mirror that behavior, because you're like, well, what do I do with myself? I'm just going to go and I'm going to engage in that behavior because that's just it. And in the research, what was so profound was that before these stresses existed in some aspects of these young people's lives, what tended to occur was that I would never see myself taking this substance, but then here I was taking it now. And it's like, wow, so that person's environment got so stressful to the point, they just ended up in this situation. And so, a lot of the times the environment had very few positive role models or positive guidance and support. And, even the education around substances, it didn't come from a positive perspective. It came more from I'm in trouble and now I'm getting education. And then the whole thing was quite negative. And so when we're trying to reinforce positive behavior and positive coping, the environment doesn't really do justice for these young people because of the lack of equity and resources that are available to them, And so it's just, I think the quote in this sentence on the right at the bottom, I don't have a problem with drugs, I have a problem without them. It really does highlight, the pain and the struggle, because, a lot of the times when someone sees a better way of coping without substances, then, it makes perfect sense to go that way. But these young people, a lot of them were still learning that, and we're very passionate about learning that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'll jump in there too, Joe. I think a really, how I sort of try to understand it is strain without resource. So there was lots of examples of significant trauma, significant loss, psychological distress, limited role models in terms of, because perhaps those who were in their life that could be role models were also dealing with trauma and also dealing with distress. So I think this piece of the puzzle, this theme that came out of the data set was so strong that we've kind of embarked on another paper to sort of explore it more fully, and how does strain without resources influence drug use behaviours. So I think it's watch this space with this one, because I think we're trying to get another paper out of this particular finding.
And so here's another quote where it's emphasizing that. So, again, the lack of positive role models, where a lot of young people, like the first quote, were away from family, right? And that sense of being away from family and connection, it basically created this sort of identity of I need to cope, I'm stressed, it causes psychological stress, and so forth. And so in the interview, when we asked, I think, do you want to talk to me through, what you were feeling in that space before you decided to use drugs? Scared. Fear, and then, we know that anger as a secondary emotion creates strong motivations to act and engage in coping strategies. And so a lot of the time these young people were just coping in the best way they knew how to, and that really did stand out from the data. And it was at the point where psychological stress was high, and so it was like, I've tried everything, I've tried to get support, I've tried, and nothing's working and nothing matters anymore. And so I felt like using was my only option. And that's where it really stands out in the data. So, the substance use wasn't something that you'd go first to. It was something that was sort of way last in the continuum of how they get there. And by the time they're there, sometimes they feel like it's reinforcing them to be stuck sometimes there without support and external guidance. Emily, did you like to say anything on this? Or?
Yeah. I'll also draw attention to that last little bit that sort of says, but there is supports that can help you if you feel that like that. I know that now. And so I think it was, again, this young female had to go through a whole heap of harm, dealing with the contact with the justice system. Lots of these sorts of experiences will then have ongoing, consequences for this young girl. But, at the time, she felt like it was her only option, and only through going through that experience, now she's familiar with, there is supports out there. If you are feeling low, if you are feeling like things are hopeless, there are people, there are things that exist. And I think that points back to, the lack of health literacy around where you might go for support if you're dealing with these sorts of things. So not only like drug and alcohol harm reduction education, but also that support system and the services and the people out there that are actually working towards providing care for young people. It's important that young people are aware of those services.
And basically, a lot of young people again have role models who are quite older, and a lot of the young people spoke about, we have one, that this particular person spoke about older people in her life taking advantage of her age, or being young, and so 30 or 40 or 50-year-olds, reflecting back how it was good in the back in the day, and she's identifying like this is a strength that she's reflecting back and saying, well, you know what, they're not good role models, and they don't really care about you, and they just feed off, just there to feed off you, and so it really starts to really unpack the environmental situation, context where this young person has grown up in, where like adults aren't sometimes seen as a source of, safety. It's quite problematic. And so, they want you to do crime. So because they're under the age, a lot of the young people spoke about, well, they'll just encourage us to do crime because, well, it's harder to charge us because we're young people, And so there was that conception. And, with substances and the whole sort of interconnected interplay of things, this young person spoke about how they found themselves in a really, uncomfortable and essentially dangerous situation. But the strength there was that they were able to reflect and identify that this is what I've taken from it. But I don't want that for myself. And I think we found that in not just one person, but multiple. And it really does highlight the power of motivation that these young people had to change. And I think the next question usually is around, it's a big reflection on resources. What, from a service perspective, what can we do to support that so they're not falling through the cracks when they're ready to change or ready to engage? Yeah.
Awesome. All right. The third theme was around the importance of, having the voices of a young person who has a lived experience of AOD harm, a lived experience of accessing services, trying to navigate the justice system and on all of the different networks that happen after you sort of are released. The importance of having those perspectives embedded in AOD harm reduction strategies, I guess. It's sort of, you can see there that there was lots of lived experience of harm from AOD, and a lot of the young people said that they gravitated towards staff, they gravitated towards services that had peer worker arms. And I think it's really important to reflect the value that a peer worker who, by the very definition, has that lived experience of, whatever the issue, it could be mental health, it could be drug use, it could be, navigating different social services, gravitated towards services that had that voice, I think. And there was a remarkable willingness, I think, and passion to give back. A lot of the young people were really, really inspiring in the way that, they weren't able to protect themselves, but man, were they passionate about trying to protect others. And so that was something that I think both Joe and I were really encouraged about. These young people, they're navigating the justice system, they're dealing with substance use issues, a whole heap of different things. And they really want to make sure that other young people are safe. And so that, I think is a really powerful thing to make sure that the sector in general holds on to and builds the capacity for a young person who has had that experience to be able to give back what can we do to make that achievable for that young person? And I think, I mean, I really relate to, everyone thinks they know what's best for you. They don't know. So it can look different for different people. Everyone has their own experiences, but yeah, there is a tendency, if there's not that peer worker arm, if there's not that consumer voice, there's a little bit of a gravitation towards, you don't really know the path that I've had to walk. So I think this quote kind of talks to, the fact that wanting to protect others, this young girl in the top quote, she doesn't want anyone else to have to walk the path that she had to walk. She'd never wish it on anyone, straight out, and she hates doing it to herself. So I think, incredibly empathetic and sensitive to other people's experiences, and that's a really powerful resource to make sure that we're not ignoring and we're not, where we're using that and we're building young people up who have the capacity to share through that way. And not just disregarding their influence or their capacity to make change. Second one, I'd love to go teach kids about the effects of it. I love how, a lot of the time they said kids, young people, and they didn't really put themselves into that category. What it does to you, how it can harm you. And I don't know, it could, some drugs could cause death. I know that for a fact, overdose. I'd love to do that. So there was a lot of discussion happening in these groups around, people need to know, young people need to know about different drugs. They need to know about, what they might do, long-term consequences, short-term consequences, but they also need to know how, if they are using, they can seek support, and they can also, if they want to, or they can reduce harm through harm reduction strategies. So I was really encouraged by the young people who wanted to protect other people from having similar experiences. Okay, I might give you 3 minutes to have a read through this one. Talks to relatable people, also talks to some of the situations, the environmental context in which, the young people are existing. They're not going to stay at home because there's domestic violence happening there. So I'm going to go to the community centre where I know that there's someone who's walked a similar path. Or I'm going to go down to the, the safe haven where there's peer workers there that kind of know, I can feel comfortable around. And just drawing attention to, it's way easier said than done. Joe, did you have anything you wanted to flesh out with this one?
Well, yeah, it's just the emphasis on, I want someone who gets it. I want someone who understands what it's like to go through what I've gone through. And it's so important, because I think it's not just, can you help me? It's do you actually get it? Because I need you to get it. And I think it's validation, because a lot of the times when young people, what came out in the research, through your talking as part of this bigger picture, is that young people were quite, they would be invalidated sometimes when they got support, or, they'll be made to do things that they don't agree with necessarily. So they're told what to do as opposed to what would actually help you. Because when given the choice and space, and we saw with the last quote, young people can actually go back and reflect and be like, actually, no, I don't want to be here. But the problem is that I think if we keep pushing forwards and trying to push them in that sort of pigeonhole, you must do this, it gets to a point where they just, it doesn't really help support. And I think, getting to someone who's relatable, relevant, and who can actually validate a young person's experience is very, very beneficial. And I think going back to what you were saying before, Emily, around young people, when we talk to them, they were like, I want to protect kids. There was a lot of emphasis on community. There's a lot of emphasis on the community and others who were like them.
Yeah, cool. So let's try and wrap it all and come away with some key points. So the first one, we need to make access to alcohol and other drug education and harm reduction education more equitable. That needs to trickle into spaces where young people are marginalised, they might be disengaged from different support systems, to ensure that, they can access health literacy resources, as well as someone who's, engaged in a school system, for example, and it's part of their curriculum. So let's focus on making it more accessible and equitable. Second, we need to be aware of what Baker calls the vulnerable consumer, the systems, the external environments that drive risk decisions, I guess, around drug use. And this, as I said, this is a little bit of a work in progress. We are sort of drafting up a paper that looks specifically at this and how we can, better provide for, or I guess create an awareness around those system drivers of behaviour and avoiding victim blaming and working to support whole of communities as opposed to just focusing on individual strategies. I think a really important point to reflect on is that any strategy that focuses solely on the motivations and perceptions of the individual, I guess, with total disregard to the social settings, the policies, the environments in which they're making those decisions, is quite unsustainable, I guess. And we risk widening the gap, that equity gap between privileged, well-resourced populations and those who are experiencing some of the things that we've spoken about today. So yeah, watch this space. Hopefully we've done the reviews for that paper. I think they're due tomorrow, so hopefully we can get some more discussion about that. And last but not least, peer workers, lived experience perspectives, they matter a whole heap. They can provide hope for vulnerable young people. And we need to really think about as a sector how we can distribute power to make sure that, you know, a young person with a lived experience of harm or lived experience of navigating systems, whatever it might be, is given the time of day and has space to make impact. And I think that points specifically to, I guess, young people in contact with the youth justice system, you know, and how that going on in their everyday life that might have ongoing stigma implications, and how, you know, we need to shift and make sure that their perspectives, their experiences are valued and used to help others. Anything else you want to add, Joe?
No, I think you covered that like amazing.
Awesome. Awesome. So if you do want to read the full paper, it's open access, so go for it. There's a lot more quotes in there, so you can get into the different perspectives. And of course, reach out if there's anything that, you want to chat about further, or if you're also keen on qualitative research. That's our team, and you can, our contact details are on the left. So that's it. I think we'll hand over to Sarah.
Hello. Wow. Congratulations, Emily and Joe. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. And I think it really added another level having Joe there as a service provider and Emily with your service provider skills as well to really complement some of those research findings. Congratulations. I mean, the fact that you got such high engagement and such rich data, I think really speaks to the Emily and Joe magic, that you were able to get people to come along and chat to you and have really rich discussions. I've got a couple of quick reflections, and I might just go through them quickly, and then we'll go and do some questions, because I know there's a couple of questions coming through in the chat as well. The first thing that I really thought about was this idea about this peer worker. I think this group of people who are within the system who, finding a way to really capitalize, and it's maybe not quite the right word, but to make sure we build up that workforce is something that requires some attention. So we might come back to that in a minute as well. There's a lot of people who you spoke to who have sought help. This help seeking thing is also quite pronounced. I think it came through quite far in the data. And so that's really interesting as well. There is willingness to engage with services. It's just about getting them all aligned. So that's something else I noticed. And the final thought is a bit about the research methods. And I can see there's a couple of questions there. So I might start with this as a question, because I think, trying to do this kind of research and talk to people about hard things is really difficult. And so, clearly you've got good engagement and you've gone and you've spoken to people. I'll go through a couple of questions, and then I'll come back to something that I've been wondering about as well. But in the chat, one of the questions that's come through was around just that engagement process. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through, did you find it difficult to engage with this group of participants, given their frequency in and out of the justice youth setting, and what sorts of methods you did to try to really engage and capture them, make them comfortable, and make the research experience a positive one?
Yeah, good question. I think, yeah, there's a few things. So we're really lucky at Youth Solutions to be connected with, I guess, the workers at different youth justice centres. We have also delivered programs previously within those settings. So it's always helpful when you have that rapport already built with some of the people who are involved in the different systems. So I think that was really helpful. I think also totally, I mean, recruitment was hard in terms of the length of time that we had to spend on recruitment, because it was quite transient. You know, there'd be young people coming in, they're young, you know, going out. So, you know, we did have a healthy amount of months put towards, you know, waiting for the young people to be in the right setting, in the right time. And we would just be really flexible. You know, we'd swing by most weeks, you know, have we got any young people today? If not, head back to the office. So being really flexible, I think, is like a non-negotiable. And I don't know, in terms of the young people, I think I've reflected with Jo before, out of all the different young people I've sort of spoken to through research, this group of young people I felt were willing to share too much too much beyond what, you know, they were clearly safe enough within our sort of company, I guess, to share their experience. I don't know whether that talks to just the reality of some of the stuff that they've gone through, and the fact that they're almost desensitized in some capacity to just, you know, some of the experiences that they've had. And you can talk more to that, Jo, if I'm just waffling now. But I do feel as if, compared to other young people, like other groups that we've done within different community settings, there was not a problem with actually building rapport and, yeah, getting young people to speak up. Jo, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, Emily, I think it's like spot on. I think it's the culture, the context we situated it in. I think we went in there, and I think, you know, in every group, you know, myself or yourself, we really made it clear that we're not the experts on them. You know, you guys are the experts on you. You know, we're here because we feel we want to make a difference and give you guys, see if we can give you a voice to advocate for what you'd like to see change. And really, like giving them the explanation of why we're here, why we're there. You know, it's not just going in and be like, well, some, you know, two researchers coming in and be like, you know, from bottom up, right? Because we know bottom up, it just doesn't really work. So we want to really just allow that to, you know, allow the conversation to flow as it is, and we get that authentic engagement. And we did. Like it was, I always like, you know, reflected back, I think it's one of my favorite projects I've been engaged in, because it's just the authenticity was just so, it was just, you know, it was amazing. And from a clinical perspective, me being in those spaces, you know, I like, you can tell there was like the young people felt safe. They did feel safe to share. And I think they were waiting for themselves to share, for that opportunity to voice. Because a lot of the times I don't think they're given, these young people, I can't speak for everyone, these young people don't have the opportunity to voice their opinions and talk about what they want, what they're feeling. And I think it's a massive thing. You know, when you start actually going down and asking those bigger, broader questions and saying like, well, I know what I think, but I don't know what you think. Help me understand. And, you know, and we're receptive and we're validating, you know, words from words. And me and Emily were just like, wow, really? And then, you know, we're getting into it. So, you know, it was really just coming up from that sort of cultural humility perspective. I love to use that word, because, you know, it's not like I'm not the expert. I don't know all the answers. And irrespective of what the literature says, let's just start from you guys and let's really speak to where you're at. And I think that really did help with the engagement and building that rapport.
Great, yeah, thanks. I'm going to go back a little bit to the peer worker idea in a minute, but quickly I just want to go through a couple of quick questions about the participants who took part. So the first one is about, I'll just read it out, from anonymous attendee. How many young people were known to be incarcerated at the time? Did you have a sense for that?
That was a bit more private, right, Jo? So, yeah. I mean, I don't know whether I'm speaking out of terms. We would chat to, you know, supervisors, guards, sort of ad hoc, and get a picture. But in terms of getting that information formally, not really part of the picture. There were, as I said, their contact with the justice system was quite diverse. So there was definitely people who had been in the system before, out of the system, in the system, back in the system. And then there was definitely participants who it was their first time in the system. So we had a little bit of that information, but in terms of reporting on that and getting an accurate sort of picture to publish and share, not so much. Did you have anything to add, Joe?
No, that's perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. The other question around the participants is around the types of substances they were using. And so someone's put in the chat here around if you thought there were many people who were using multiple substances.
Yeah.
Or had experiences with multiple substances. Yeah, you did. And
Definitely.
For approximately how many?
I would say across the board, it was definitely poly drug use. I also will draw attention to the mix of illicit and pharmaceutical. I think that came up in the sample that, young people, mix a bit of this, but, it might be benzodiazepines, it might be ketamine, get that in there. So definitely poly drug use, very familiar with lots of different substances. But I don't know about you, Joe, I had to come back to the office and Google and be like, oh, that's what that is. So lots of knowledge about where to get the drugs, what drugs are out there, and dabbling in across the board, I would say, is the general feel. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So, I'd be really interested just to hear a little bit about this peer worker idea. It's clearly come through quite heavily in the data that you've collected. I'm wondering if, maybe start with Joe, if you've got any reflections on what we can be doing or how we could support or build this peer worker workforce and make it a really, central and valuable part of the sector.
Yeah, look, I can speak from the research. I speak as my own experience too, coming from, I'm in the sector and I work with colleagues who are peer workers. And I think in the research, what really came out of it was that it's that shared understanding. We can write about things as professionals, as research. We can write about things. We can have a discussion about things. We can talk about stories. We can talk about different narratives and all that stuff, right? But I think when you've gone through something, that in itself is knowledge, standalone knowledge in its own self. That in itself is a different form of knowledge. It's like knowledge that's formed in the being. It's the being aspect that's developing. And, like I always say to people, we can sit around here and talk about sugar and everyone can say a word that reminds them of what sugar is. It's sweet. But you'll never know what it is unless you actually take a spoon and try it. And then you'll know what it's like to actually be in it, right? And I think from, a peer support perspective, I think it's fair. And so it really opens up the conversation for people wanting support. Like, I know you get it because you've been through it, and tell me how did you get to the other end, or tell me how you're navigating this. And I think that's so important because I think Emily before stated that it really does help them. It really does tell them that, hey, hang on, there's another narrative that you can have. There's another narrative that you can go beyond. You're not just a young person who's stuck in corrections. You're not just this type of person. There's actually more to you. There's more potential here. And I think it really does tell that message. And, having peer support workers, I think it's amazing. I think it's a fabulous idea because, there's not, in service provision, not one support is the perfect support. Not one place is the perfect place to get support. And, what's the perfect treatment? Doesn't exist. So the more treatment variety we have, the more contacts and different professions and people we can speak to, the better the choice for people is. And so it does give back the consumer or the client or young people more of a choice in that area to be able to highlight their needs and hopefully receive what they want. But yeah, so Emily, did you want to say anything on top of that?
So I think, I think peer work or, consumer representatives, I think it goes a long way in, how I say this, making sure that we're working towards distributing power between, institutions and people that might be in positions of authority to make decisions around stuff. I also think that peer worker roles and having consumer representatives in services really helps get everyone feel like they're on the same like a level playing field, if that makes sense, so that you might be coming into a service or whatever, you don't feel as if you're the one with the, I don't know really how you're the victim, I guess, and you're the one that has made the poor decisions, and that's why you're here. I think having that peer worker, having that sort of arm, I think does create a soft entry point into highly clinical services. And I do think it works to distribute power and help people, I guess, reduce the stigma around AOD use potentially. Yeah,
it's great. I mean, it's a real opportunity, I think, for the sector, and I think it's really growing in force at the moment. There seems to be quite a lot of attention in the space. Thank you. So quick question on I think you mentioned, I think it was around theme 1, you were talking about harm reduction, Em, and you're saying that there was a couple of examples only of participants reporting harm reduction.
Yep.
There's a question here about like sort of how you phrased that. So how did you, because that's such a kind of technical term, I guess, that we use as researchers and service providers and policymakers. How did you ask that question? Do you feel like there was potentially a terminology barrier with participants not understanding what it was we're asking about? So great question. And that wasn't part of the initial questions. It was really like, if someone is using, how do they keep themselves safe? And we did introduce harm reduction as a term, I guess, and as a topic, because we kind of thought this is a great opportunity for us to actually introduce the terminology, but also link it back to, it's actually just trying to keep someone safe. So we definitely didn't lead in with, do you know about harm reduction? We definitely tried to shift our terminology to make sure that we made sense. And honestly, if we didn't make sense, they let us know. They're like, we don't know what you're talking, we don't know what you're talking about. I think there was multiple examples where if we use the word cannabis, well, what are you talking about? I don't know what cannabis is. I know what weed is, but so there was definitely a lot of fleshing out those sorts of things. And I think it was really nice that we were able to, they knew a lot of stuff that we didn't know, and then we knew stuff that perhaps they, could learn. So I think I've reflected with Jo in the past that actually the focus groups were a really nice place to actually upskill the participants around what harm reduction is and where you might go for that kind of information. Good question. That's great. Yeah, it is. That's great. I really like how you phrase that. Something that we think so hard about terminology, and then you just said it really simply and it makes complete sense. Well done. So the next question, I think it might have just, here it is. So just sort of following on from that, did participants tell you about any particular education resources about AOD use or harm reduction that they liked, or that really related to them, or that they found easy to use or digest? Did you get to that level of detail?
I would say no. I would say that there was quite limited awareness. A lot of the young people weren't within the school system, so they weren't getting any of that stuff that might be naturally built into curriculums, PDHPE or whatnot, or external services going into schools. I would say that there was very limited awareness. What would you say, Jo?
No, I agree. There was quite limited awareness, and I think a lot of the the beneficial stories and narratives of young people where it was positive were people in there, maybe like the quote, there was someone in the community they knew that you can go to for support, or maybe someone who's helped a friend that they know they can go to. So it's very community driven, as opposed to there's a service we can go to if we need support. So I think it really did come out like that. Spot on.
Resources, like health literacy resources weren't flagged, if that makes sense.
So I mean I won't try and overinterpret that, but okay. Okay, we're getting close to the end. There's a little bit of discussion on the chat just about the peer worker thing, so I'm just going to come back to that quickly before we wrap up. So one of the questions is around the peer workforce. It's really developed in the mental health space. We haven't seen the same sort of takeoff or uptake, I should say, in drug and alcohol and justice. Did you have any thoughts on that? Is it something that you're seeing happening, or is there particular barriers within this within the justice and drug and alcohol space that you think might be impeding that, or do you think it's just about to happen and a little bit slower?
It's a good question. I'll start, Jo, and then I'll hand it over to you. I think so. We did present this study back to Department of Justice, and so they had, we had a whole heap of people who were within the system that we presented to, and I think there were a few questions and comments about, oh, but we have tried to sort of have some lived experiences involved in facilitation and just being in the sector, in the system. And kind of, I don't want to say the word failed attempts, but kind of like, oh, there's some risks here, there's this, we hadn't thought about this, we hadn't thought about this. And I think, Jo and I have reflected that you don't throw someone into a peer worker role without providing training. You don't throw them into that sort of peer worker role without building the scaffolding around them to make sure that they can do their job well. So I know that we've spoken about that, Jo, before, so I don't know whether you want to add anything around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I work with peer workers myself. My colleagues are 50% peer workers, and yes, there's a considerable amount of training that needs to go there to for support, and they bring such a rich context to our working environment, and very grateful for them. But yeah, I think there's, if for justice and the alcohol and drug sector, I think it's about not just exactly what Emily said, just getting someone in and off you go. You should know what you're doing. I think it's actually providing time and support, and every job, so that person's still bound by the context that they're working in and the challenges that any clinician will have in a way. So it's not just you've gone through it, off you go. I think it's actually taking a step back and being like, how can we support you, but do your work more effectively? And I think power dynamics do play a role, because again, you don't want to just get someone from a peer work perspective coming in and then being like, okay, you have such and such this in your past, you must know how to deal with it straight away. So you're not coming in saying, oh, you should know what to do because you've gone through it, because that can be very invalidating for a person who's actually gone through it, because their story might not be the same story that that person that they're trying to help. So it's really being very open-minded and being very receptive to the support peers need to be able to do the work. And I think it's just trying to, again, it's a very new concept and there will be challenges, but I think the benefits, I can wholeheartedly say that the benefits of having peers in the workforce absolutely outweighs any sort of challenges around that, because the challenges are only short term as you keep adjusting. And I think having peers in the sector will significantly influence and benefit the treatment and support that are offered to consumers and clients and people needing support.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, excellent. It's a really nice spot to finish, actually. You've really painted a picture for some of the opportunities and steps to take this research and put it into practice. So we're just out of time. So I just want to take a minute to really thank you both. Thanks, Emily and Joseph, for presenting this really great research today, and also to all the attendees who's dialed in and asked lots of interesting questions. We've got through most of them. Please feel free to reach out to Emily or Jo if you want to ask any more questions about the research. Sorry for the couple that I didn't get to. And I just want to take a minute before we wrap just to alert you to the next upcoming webinars, my computer, that are coming up over the next couple of weeks. Next week, we're actually taking a break. We're going to have a week off webinars, so you can all have an hour back in your life on Thursday afternoon. And then the following week, we've got, we're really lucky actually to be joined by one of our good friends from NCEDA, Professor Jacqueline Bowden, who's going to be talking on informing and changing Australian parental alcohol supply practices. And then following that will be Anya Boos from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, talking on the international standards for treatment of drug use disorders. So everybody have a lovely afternoon, and thanks again to Emily and Joseph. We've had a great afternoon talking through some really interesting issues, so congratulations and thanks again.
Thanks,
guys.
See
you later.